The other thing we need to clarify at the beginning is the hospital. We think of a hospital as the building where Canterbury Hospital is, St George Hospital, Bankstown Hospital. We know that there are doctors and nurses and can't work without those people and all the other cleaners and cooks and all that sort of thing. But we sort of focus on the building as the location. Now in wartime, that's different. A hospital might be set up by doctors and whatever men are there, and maybe nursing sisters, and they have no premises whatever. They might go overseas, and when they begin to operate as a hospital, they might be in a tent or tents. They might be in a school that they take over. They might be in a barn somewhere in France, as in World War I. So we've got to look a little differently at what a hospital is. The next point to draw to your attention is that here at Herne Bay, there were 5 sets of buildings that were called hospitals. Only one of them, the one approximately where we are now, was really used with patients. The others weren't, fortunately, they were not needed for casualties or sickness by the American troops and so on. So, you know, we've got 5 hospitals and we've got 1 hospital, if you like, in one part of those 5. And I'll talk about the various hospitals, but what happened was that the United States Army in World War I asked the major hospitals in universities if they would provide doctors and nurses to form a hospital unit. And one of those was Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. Johns with an S on the end of it, not John Hospital, John Hopkins. And in 1940, the US Army asked them again if they would set up a 1,000-bed hospital unit to go overseas, if required. By the time that they were required, they were told that they didn't want 1,000-bed groups. They wanted 500. They wanted a 500 group. They countered by saying, well, how about we split in 2 and we have 2 500 hospital units. The Army accepted this, and as a result, they had the 18th General Hospital, which was the World War I name, and which went with the other group, if you like, and the one that came here was the 118th, just to maintain the association. The 18th spent the war, first of all, in New Zealand, and then in Fiji, where they dealt with casualties from the Solomons. And after they were no longer required there, they went via Melbourne to India and set up a hospital there. The 118th, when they were mobilised, went to a camp, and they had attached to the doctors and nurses enlisted men who were to be the cooks and, you know, all the additional staff that they needed. They had no idea where they were going, but they were put on a train that went west into San Francisco. And when they got there, they were put on a ship that came out into the Pacific, and they had contests to whether they were going to Australia or New Zealand or wherever. In fact, they did go to New Zealand for one day, and then they came on to Melbourne and went by train from Melbourne to Sydney. I think the reason was that you remember the submarine attack in Sydney Harbour in 1942 coincided with when they were about to come across the Tasman Sea, so they put them into Melbourne instead. In Melbourne, they looked at hospital facilities down there. There was already a US Army hospital, and then they were put on a train and came up to Sydney. They had no premises ready for them. They didn't know where they were going to go. They looked around at all sorts of places and couldn't find a suitably large place. They were particularly keen on Prince Henry Hospital, which would have meant moving all the Australian people out of there, but they realised that it was open to shelling and being so close to the coast and close to the Bunurong power station, so they said no, that wasn't really suitable. Eventually they made contact with Prince Alfred Hospital, and the hospital there agreed to move beds around, and they gave the Yanks 400 beds there. They also looked at the Hydro Majestic at Medlow Bath and hoped to take that over. They sent staff up there to repaint and do all sorts of things, and when they were just about ready to move some of the 118th patients, the powers that be in Sydney, the US Army people, decided they'd give it to one of the other hospital units that didn't have any premises anyway. It was August 1942 that they admitted the first patients to Royal Prince Alfred, and they took American people and Filipinos who had come to Sydney as a result of the campaigns there, and were then housed in Australian Army hospitals, such as the one at Concord, or the, I better watch this or I'll go. I did tell somebody I might go for 2 hours, but I promise I won't go more than an hour, but I better speed up. Where was I? Yeah, and the American casualties and so on were in civilian hospitals, and so the Yanks were pleased to take over their own people. They looked all over the place for ground when they couldn't find a suitable school or hospital building or anything else for them, and eventually it was decided to build a hospital for them at Ermington Rydalmere. But then it was decided that it was far too costly to provide sewerage from that site. That would be at present-day Silverwater. And I don't know who it was, but probably somebody in the Water Board who said, well, go to Herne Bay, we'll build there and we'll put a pump line up to the sewerage at WWII, which was existing at that time. Once they decided on one hospital, the Yanks decided they needed another one, and then they needed 2 more, and then finally a 5th one. There were to be 5 hospitals, as I said. 3 of them were for 750 beds and 2 of 1,000 beds, a total of 4,250 beds in this area. Now get an idea of this. I intended to look up the internet and see how big Prince Alfred and so on are, but I think they're about 800 beds. Canterbury's about 200. So imagine 4,250 beds being available in this small area.